42,000 explosions in a single night, and not one German general understood that the war was already lost until morning. There was one truth that every Wehrmacht officer knew in 1943. War is decided at the front. With tanks, aviation, fire, and steel, everything else is simply mechanics, reliable, precise German mechanics. And those mechanics ran on rails. Thousands of kilometers of railways carried eastward every day what any army needs to avoid becoming an armed mob. Fuel for tanks, shells for artillery, food, reinforcements, new equipment from the factories of the Ruhr. The rails were not simply infrastructure. They were the spine of the Wehrmacht. Without stable supply lines, any army would literally suffocate in place. And the German General Staff understood this better than anyone else in the world. The German Reichsbahn was considered the finest railway system in the world. Schedules calibrated to the second. Coded routes, special military commandants with emergency powers, garrison guards along every key line across the occupied territories. By 1943, the Germans had already learned hard lessons. Strips of forest 50 meters wide were cleared on each side of the tracks. Fortified posts stood every few kilometers. Armored rail cars patrolled the lines every night without pause. Special security divisions kept watch around the clock. These were not random soldiers, trained men who knew how to search for mines, how to read tracks in the earth, how to respond to a sabotage within minutes. The system appeared impenetrable. No army in history had ever managed to destroy an enemy railway network without air superiority or ground dominance. Aerial bombing damaged the tracks, but repair crews restored them within hours. Isolated acts of sabotage irritated the commandants, but never stopped the system entirely. In Berlin, no one seriously considered a scenario in which thousands of men without aviation or artillery, armed only with explosives and a radio, could strangle an entire army group from within. It seemed impossible. It contradicted every lesson of military experience accumulated over centuries. But in the night between the 2nd and 3rd of August, 1943, that is precisely what happened. German certainty shattered into gravel and burning sleepers. Everywhere at once, in a single night. And what began then in the Soviet forests changed forever the understanding of where the outcome of a war is truly decided. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back several months. To the winter of 1943, to the frozen forests of the Bryansk region, where among smoky dugouts and pine thickets an idea was being born that the Germans would later call a nightmare. Dmitry Medvedev is 41 years old in 1943, a career state security officer with pre-war experience. A methodical man, cold in his calculations, but possessing a rare quality that in partisan warfare was worth more than any weapon. Medvedev could make different people act as a single mechanism. Former collective farm workers and city engineers, young female radio operators and experienced sappers, people who had never held a weapon before the war, and people who had fought back in the Civil War. All of them he turned into one coordinated machine. His unit was called the Victors, and these were not village men with hunting rifles as Berlin portrayed Soviet partisans in its newspapers. These were trained demolition specialists, radio operators with cipher books, scouts who could read German railway timetables and understand exactly what was hidden behind them. But to understand why Medvedev and thousands of commanders like him were needed, you have to look at the map of the Eastern Front in the spring of 1943. Because it was there, on that map, that a plan was being born that was meant to change everything. Soviet intelligence in the spring of 1943 records alarming movement along German supply lines. Trains heading east carry unusual cargo. Beneath tarpaulins, the outlines of turrets are visible, long armored hulls barely fitting within the clearance of the flat cars. These are Tigers and Panthers, hundreds of units of the most advanced armor Hitler is assembling for a single operation. An operation meant to turn the tide of the war in the East. It received the name Citadel. The location, the Kursk salient, a vast arc of the Soviet front cutting deep into German positions. Soviet command knows this in advance. Intelligence had uncovered the German plans early enough. The Kursk salient begins fortifying at a frantic pace. Thousands of anti-tank guns, millions of mines, 8 defensive belts extending to a depth of 300 kilometers. The Red Army prepares to absorb the blow, but in Moscow, at the partisan movement headquarters, they look at the same map and see something entirely different. They see not only the Kursk salient, they see lines, thin threads of railways stretching from German supply bases to the front. The lines along which those very tigers are moving, those very shells, that very fuel without which they become useless iron. And someone at that headquarters asks a simple question: what happens if those lines disappear? Not in one place, not in 10, but everywhere at once, in a single night, along the entire length of the German rear area from the Baltic to Ukraine. The answer is obvious. The German offensive at Kursk will choke not from Soviet tanks, but from a shortage of fuel and ammunition. A machine without fuel is simply metal. The most powerful army in the world without supply becomes a crowd of armed men stranded in someone else's land. This is how Operation Rail War is born. The first attempt in history to use partisan forces not as a peripheral irritant, but as a strategic instrument within a unified military plan. The scale of what was conceived was unprecedented. The central headquarters of the partisan movement coordinated the actions of hundreds of units simultaneously. Tons of explosives were airlifted from the mainland. Special instructors trained demolition teams in new mining techniques right inside forest camps. Radio operators received ciphers and frequencies for use on the night of the operation. Moscow engineers and design bureaus worked on a problem that sounded almost mathematical: how to achieve maximum paralysis of the railway network with minimum expenditure of explosives. Exactly where to strike so that one explosion would stop not one train, but an entire supply direction. They found the answer in the very design of the railway track. There was no need to blow up bridges or stations. It was enough to destroy rail joints. A small charge, quick to plant. The line put out of action for several hours. If there are tens of thousands of such charges and all of them detonate simultaneously, several hours become a catastrophe. But there was one problem that Soviet commanders knew all too well. Explosives were catastrophically scarce. Every operation required precise calculation. You could not spend kilograms of TNT on a secondary stretch of track if that TNT was needed for a strike against a key junction 100 kilometers away. That is why every group received a strict limit, a defined stretch of track, a precise time, no improvisation, no deviation from the plan, because the plan was a single organism in which every action was part of the overall design. And by the summer of 1943, everything was ready. The units had taken their positions, explosives distributed among the groups, ciphers handed to the radio operators. Medvedev and hundreds of commanders like him were waiting for one thing: a signal from Moscow. One short code word, after which 100,000 people would simultaneously rise from the darkness and move toward the rails. On the 4th of July, 1943, Hitler gives the order to begin Operation Citadel. German armored columns move forward. The finest equipment the Reich has ever built advances toward the Kursk salient from the north and south simultaneously. On the northern face, Army Group Center attacks. On the southern face, Army Group South, under the command of von Manstein. Between them, in the jaws of the steel pincers, the Soviet armies. More than 1 million men, thousands of guns. 8 lines of defense dug into the earth to a depth of 300 kilometers. German tank crews believe in victory. Their machines are new. Their armor is thicker than anything they have faced before. The Tiger withstands hits from most Soviet guns at the front. The Panther is faster and more maneuverable than previous machines. The crews are experienced. They have done this before. Outside Warsaw, outside Paris, outside Kiev. But outside Kursk, something goes wrong from the very first hours. The Soviet defense does not crumble under the first blow as it did in 41. It absorbs the German wedges, slows them, grinds them down. Every kilometer costs dozens of machines. Every breakthrough is plugged by Soviet reserves before the Germans can develop it. On the 12th of July, near Prokhorovka, something happens that no one in the German headquarters expected. Soviet tank armies advance to meet them. They do not retreat. They do not maneuver. They drive straight into the face of the German wedges. A meeting engagement on a narrow field between a railway embankment and the Sel River. Hundreds of machines on both sides in a space with no room to turn. Tigers burn, Panthers burn. Soviet tanks burn too, but there are more of them, and reserves stand behind them. By the evening of the 12th of July, the German offensive on the southern face loses its momentum entirely. Operation Citadel is dying, not at once, slowly, like a machine running out of fuel on a steep climb. At precisely this moment, German headquarters urgently need to bring up reserves to replace losses in equipment and ammunition. The tanks at Prokhorovka exhausted their shells within hours of fighting. Fuel was consumed at an extraordinary rate. All of it must be brought from the west, by rail, right now. And at precisely this moment, Moscow transmits the code word, the start of Operation Rail War, the night between the 2nd and 3rd of August, 1943. Across the entire occupied Soviet territory, people rise from the darkness, more than 100,000 of them. But before speaking of what happened that night on the scale of the entire front, we need to come down lower, to the ground, to one man, to one group of 4 people lying at the edge of a forest and looking at rails 200 meters away, because that is exactly what this war looked like in reality. Not on maps in headquarters, but like this: 4 people, a dark field, and a German patrol 150 meters away. The group commander is 22 years old. His name is Nikolai. Before the war, he studied to be a civil engineer in Kursk. He never imagined he would lie in wet grass at night counting seconds between passes of the German Guard. For 3 nights in a row before the operation, Nikolai lay in this same spot and watched. He recorded in a notebook the time the rail car passed. He timed how many minutes before the foot patrol returned. He counted the sentries on the nearest watchtower. He studied where the searchlight beam moved and at what moment darkness returned to the field. Now he knows this stretch of track better than the German commandant who guards it. He knows he has exactly 23 minutes between the departure of the rail car and the return of the foot patrol. 23 minutes to cross the open field, reach the embankment, plant the mines, and return to the forest. In theory, it is possible. He has calculated it, checked it several times in his mind. But between theory and the rails, there are 200 meters of open ground under a searchlight. And one small accident, a patrol changing its route, a rail car running late, a sentry lighting a cigarette in an unexpected place, could cost all 4 of them their lives. 23:50. The rail car has passed. Nikolai looks at his watch. 5 seconds. 10. Then he raises his hand and brings it down. Signal. The 4 begin to move. They crawl. They do not walk. They do not run. They crawl on their stomachs through the wet August grass. Every movement is precise. Elbow forward, knee, elbow, knee. The head does not rise above the level of the grass by a single centimeter. To the left, 180 meters away, the searchlight beam from the tower moves slowly along the embankment. To the right, beyond the bend in the track, the voices of the German patrol. They are talking, laughing about something. Nikolai does not understand the words but hears the tone. An ordinary conversation between men who are bored standing watch in the night. 100 meters to the embankment. The searchlight beam swings in their direction. Stop! All 4 freeze. Faces down. The beam passes over them. Slowly, Nikolai counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. The beam moves away to the other side. 80 meters. 60. 40. Nikolai hears his own breathing and forces himself to breathe more slowly, more evenly. His hands must be steady. His hands must work precisely when the moment comes. Everything depends on the hands. 20 meters. The embankment. The rail. Nikolai places his palm on the cold metal and freezes for a moment. Somewhere out there, 200 kilometers from here, other hands are touching other rails. In Belarus, in Ukraine, outside Smolensk, 100,000 people are doing the same thing right now. Nikolai opens his bag. His fingers work from memory. He has done this 30 times at the training base in the forest outside Bryansk. The instructor stood beside him and counted seconds aloud. 30 seconds for preparation, 20 for placement, 10 for concealment, 1 minute total for one joint. But the instructor did not stand next to a German machine gun nest 150 meters away, and the ground at the training base was not as hard as this packed gravel beneath the rail, and his hands at the training base did not shake the way they shake now, in the darkness, under the searchlight, with a patrol at his back. Nikolai stops himself. One slow exhale. Then he begins working again. His fingers find the bolts securing the rail. They find the gap between the base of the rail and the sleeper. That is where the charge will go. Not under the sleeper, not beside it, exactly where metal meets metal. This was the idea of the Moscow engineers. Simple in theory, demanding precision in execution. An explosion at the joint between two rails destroyed both ends simultaneously. The repair crew would need to replace not one but 2 sections of track. Twice the time, twice the material, twice as many men exposed in the open while the line stayed down. The charge is in place, the detonator inserted. Nikolai smooths the gravel around the planted mine with precise movements of his palm. From any angle, even at close range, nothing is visible. Just a rail, just an embankment, just a night. He looks at his watch. 7 minutes have passed since reaching the embankment. 16 remain before the patrol returns. Enough for 2 more joints. Nikolai moves along the rail, just slowly, keeping low. The next joint is 20 meters ahead. At this same moment, on this same night, 100 kilometers to the north, another group lies beside another embankment. 200 kilometers to the west, a third group is already finishing work on its stretch of track. In Belarus, in Ukraine, outside Smolensk, outside Vitebsk, outside Gomel. More than 100,000 people are doing exactly what Nikolai is doing right now. In one night, along thousands of kilometers of German railways simultaneously. The German guard posts do not know this. Each of them sees only their own stretch of track, their own 200 meters of embankment. None of them sees the complete picture. Only Moscow sees the picture. Their communications operators receive reports from radio operators of partisan units and mark points on the map. The points multiply. They spread from north to south, from west to east, like lights being lit one after another across the vast darkness of occupied land. Nikolai finishes work on the third joint. He looks at his watch. 11 minutes until the patrol. He signals the group. Withdraw. The 4 begin moving back along the same path they came, the same 200 meters, the same wet grass, the same searchlight. Halfway back, the voices of the patrol grow louder. They are returning early. Nikolai hears this and understands immediately. Something has changed in their rhythm. The patrol is moving faster than usual. Perhaps they heard something. Perhaps they simply decided to cut their route short. The reason does not matter. What matters is one thing: they are coming this way. Stop. The 4 freeze. Nikolai slowly turns his head. 100 meters behind them, along the embankment, 2 men move with torches. They shine them at their feet. They are talking. One of them stops and looks out toward the dark field. Nikolai does not breathe. He counts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The German with the torch stares into the darkness. For a long time. Too long. Then he says something to his partner and slowly walks on along the track. The torch disappears around the bend of the embankment. The four wait another 2 minutes. Then Nikolai raises his hand. Move. The last 100 meters to the forest they cover faster. With less caution now, because time has run out and every second in the open is one risk too many. The forest. Darkness beneath the pines. Nikolai rolls onto his back and looks up at the sky through the branches. His heart is beating so hard he can hear it in his ears. 3 joints. They are alive. He lies there and waits for his breathing to level out. Then he takes out his notebook. He writes, 3 joints, time of placement, time of withdrawal, deviation of the patrol from its usual schedule. These notes will go with a report to headquarters. There they will be combined with reports from other groups. From hundreds of such notes, the complete picture will emerge. For now, Nikolai knows nothing beyond his 3 joints. He does not know that on this same night his comrades have planted thousands of identical charges along thousands of kilometers of track. He does not know that by dawn, German dispatchers will be staring at their train movement charts with growing horror. 100 kilometers to the east, at a junction station of the German Railway Command, the duty officer studies the train movement chart. The first reports begin arriving around 2 in the morning. 1 stretch of track damaged. A train stopped, a repair crew dispatched. Standard procedure. 20 minutes later, a second report. Another stretch. A different direction. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. The duty officer begins calling neighboring commands. The same picture there, and further on, and everywhere. By 3 in the morning, there are more than 30 stoppage points on the movement chart. By 4, there are more than 100. The duty officer picks up the telephone and calls upward. To the Railway Command headquarters of the Army Group. They are already awake there. They already know. By dawn on the 3rd of August 1943, Soviet partisans had destroyed more than 42,000 rail joints in a single night. 42,000. Across thousands of kilometers of German lines from the Baltic to Ukraine. A figure that existed in no German assessment of enemy capabilities. Nowhere. Never. The German railway restoration system was as finely tuned as the lines themselves. Repair trains stood on sidings at every major station. Crews of workers were on duty around the clock. Stocks of rails and sleepers had been distributed along the lines in advance, precisely for such an event. And in the first days after the 2nd of August, the system did indeed respond. Repair crews went out onto the lines at dawn. They replaced damaged sections. They restored movement on individual stretches. German command breathed again. The situation was manageable. It had not yet become critical. But the people in the forest did not stop. Because Operation Rail War was not a single blow. It was the first wave. A second followed, then a third. Partisan groups returned to the same stretches after a few nights and blew up the freshly restored joints again. German repair crews arrived and found their work destroyed, in the same place. Again, this was a new principle of warfare, not a single strike but constant pressure, unrelenting, exhausting. German crews worked during the day. At night, the partisans worked again, day after day, night after night, and the Germans did not have enough men to repair the tracks and guard them densely enough at the same time. Moscow engineers added one more element that transformed simple sabotage into something fundamentally different. A new mine that German sappers did not know how to disarm. Flat, almost invisible in the packed embankment soil, with a double fuse inside. The first fuse was triggered by the pressure of the locomotive wheel and only armed the second. The locomotive pressed on it and rolled on. The driver heard nothing suspicious. Then, under the heavy freight wagons or under the fuel tankers, the second fuse fired, and the train went off the rails already carrying its full load. German sappers found the first fuse and believed the mine had been neutralized. They reported accordingly. The stretch was declared safe. The train received clearance to proceed. Then the second fuse did its work, and the sappers who had reported the stretch as safe were no longer alive. German command issued new instructions for sapper teams. More thorough inspection, slower progress along the track, special probes for checking the soil to greater depth. All of this slowed the restoration of lines even further. That was precisely what Moscow had been working toward. But the true turning point came in the middle of August when a decision was made at partisan movement headquarters that German railway officers would later call the most intelligent strike of the enemy in the entire war. The decision to move from mass demolition to precision targeting, to the selection of specific objectives. Every German train carried a code number and an encrypted routing document. Partisan radio operators had been intercepting German railway communications for months. Piece by piece, from different sources, a system for decoding these numbers was taking shape. Gradually, the picture became clearer. Trains with numbers in a certain range carried military equipment. Tank cars with specific letter codes contained fuel for armored vehicles. Trains with priority markings carried ammunition for specific divisions on specific sectors of the front. Now, partisan groups received not simply an order to blow up rails. They received a precise assignment. On such a night, on such a stretch of track, a train with a particular code is expected. This is fuel for the 4th Panzer Army. This train is to be destroyed. Everything else is to be allowed through. Explosives are scarce. Every gram must work. The effect proved devastating precisely because it was invisible from inside the German system. Household freight moved through. Troop trains ran without delay, but armored echelons failed again and again to reach the front. They burned, they derailed. They sat stranded at junction stations under guard that had nothing left for anything else. German intelligence searched for the cause within its own structures. It suspected leaks in headquarters. It changed the code designations of trains. It introduced new identification systems. But partisan radio operators intercepted the new communications and again passed the data to the units. The circle closed again and again. If you are drawn to these hidden stories of how the war was decided not on battlefields but in forests and radio rooms, subscribe to the channel. These stories are kept in archives, in yellowed documents, in the memories of people who are no longer here. Your subscription helps us tell them. By the end of September 1943, the operation had grown into a new phase called concert. Strikes were now delivered in strict coordination with the offensive operations of regular Soviet fronts. When Soviet forces went on the attack in a particular direction, partisans simultaneously cut the supply lines of the German grouping in exactly that area. German reserves could not reach the point of breakthrough in time. Ammunition was delayed by several days at the moment it was needed within hours. Fuel for counterattacking tanks sat at a siding 150 kilometers from the front. Ahead lay a destroyed joint and a repair crew that had already been working for 3 days under the threat of new demolitions. The Wehrmacht fought under conditions of constant deficit, not catastrophic, not complete paralysis, but constant, grinding shortage of everything. Shells 10% below what was needed, fuel 15% short of calculated requirements. Those percentages were enough to ensure that counterattacks failed, that defenses cracked where they should have held, that the war slowly and inevitably turned in another direction. The full strategic picture of Operation Rail War only became clear after the end of the war, when German archives became available to historians and military analysts. What they found in the yellowed folders of the Wehrmacht Railway Command astonished even the professionals. In the period from August to October 1943, Soviet partisans carried out more than 213,000 demolitions of railway objects. More than 11,000 trains were derailed, hundreds of bridges destroyed or damaged, thousands of units of rolling stock destroyed directly on the tracks. But the numbers are only half the story. The other half is what happened to the German war machine in response to those numbers, what German command was forced to do in order to protect its lines, and at what cost to the front that protection came. By the autumn of 1943, the Wehrmacht was keeping more than 500,000 soldiers on railway guard duty across the occupied territories. 500,000 men, not at the front, not in trenches, on watchtowers along the rails, in armored trains, in repair crews, in security garrisons strung along thousands of kilometers of track. Hitler personally signed an order to strengthen railway protection, allocating additional security divisions for the purpose. Divisions that were needed on the Eastern Front. Divisions that could have sealed breaches in the defense outside Kharkov, or reinforced counterattacks outside Smolensk. Instead, they stood beside rails. What German command failed to understand for many months was that Soviet partisan headquarters were operating according to a unified operational plan. That every demolition in the Bryansk forest was part of the Soviet General Staff's design. That the invisible war on the rails and the visible war at the front were one and the same thing. When Soviet forces went on the offensive outside Smolensk, partisans struck the supply lines of the German grouping in exactly that area. When the Dnieper-Carpathian operation began, sabotage groups cut the withdrawal routes and reinforcement lines in the south. Every blow against the rails was coordinated with a blow at the front. German headquarters encountered the same picture again and again. A Soviet offensive begins. Reserves must be transferred. The reserves are loaded onto trains. The trains stop halfway due to a destroyed stretch of track. The reserves arrive 2 or 3 days late, and in 2 days, the front line has already shifted. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, reported to Hitler in the autumn of 1943 that railway communications in the sector of Army Group Center were operating with constant disruption. Supply capacity had been reduced by approximately 35% compared to planned figures. 35%? This is not simply a figure in a report. It is tanks standing without fuel 100 kilometers from the front line. It is guns that fall silent because the shells are stuck at a siding. It is divisions that cannot counterattack because their reserves did not arrive in time. At this same moment, Soviet fronts are advancing. They take Kharkov. They cross the Dnieper. They liberate Kiev. And the German divisions that were supposed to counterattack cannot. Not because they lack courage or skill, but because their supply is lying off the rails in the Bryansk forests. Railway sabotage had ceased to be partisan activity on the periphery of the war. It had become a full element of strategic offensive operations. For the first time in history, irregular forces were acting as an integral part of regular army operations across an entire theater of war. By the end of 1943, the German Reichsbahn in the east could supply the front with approximately 60% of the necessary provisions. Not 100, not 80, 60. 40% of German logistics on the Eastern Front had been destroyed by people in the forest, without a single tank engagement, without a single air raid, by the hands of people with notebooks and a few kilograms of explosives. After the war, Dmitry Medvedev would write a book. It would be published in 1951 under the title "It Happened Near Rovno," memoirs of his unit's operations behind enemy lines. The book would sell millions of copies. It would be studied in military academies. A film would be made from it, but it would contain very little about the rails, because Operation Rail War would remain partially classified for many years to come. Too many details of intelligence methods that Soviet security services did not want to reveal even decades after the victory. Nikolai, that young sapper from the forest unit who at 22 years of age crawled 150 meters from a German patrol, survived. He made it to 1945. He came home. He worked at a factory. He died in 1987 in a small town outside Kursk. He wrote no memoirs. There is no article about him in any encyclopedia. His name is not carved on any famous monument. But on that night in August 1943, his hands planted one of the 42,000 mines that together changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. There were thousands of people like him. Young female radio operators of 18 and 19 years old who transmitted encrypted messages from the forest, knowing that German direction-finding units were searching for their signal at that very moment. Engineers in Moscow designed bureaus who devised new mines and understood that their devices would kill people, but knew that the alternative was worse. Local residents who passed information about train movements through occupation services, knowing that the penalty was immediate execution. They were not at the Kursk salient. Their names do not appear in reports about the capture of cities. They fought on a front with no front line, in a war that could not be seen, in a war that no one filmed and no one wrote about in the newspapers. Today, when we look at the campaign maps of 1943 and 44 and see the rapid Soviet advances, we often ask one question: why could the Germans not counterattack? Where were their reserves? Why did their supply fail again and again at precisely the moments when it was needed most? Part of the answer lies in the archives of the German Reichsbahn. In reports about delayed trains, in maps of destroyed stretches of track, in summaries of rolling stock losses, in reports about security divisions that stood beside rails instead of standing at the front. The answer was in the forest. It was always in the forest. If this story moved you, press like. It is the only way to tell us that stories like this matter and to help other people find them. We find these accounts in archives, in yellowed military dispatches, in memoirs that were never translated into other languages. If you want them not to disappear, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. It matters to us to know where the people are who care about what happened in these forests 80 years ago. Thank you for ensuring that Nikolai and 100,000 nameless fighters of Operation Rail War do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.